actual endocrine glands, organs that we've been talking about their function. And we'll start with two that are up in the head, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is directly connected to the pituitary through a hypophysis with a stalk of tissue that is referred to as the infundibulum. The pituitary secretes at least 8 major hormones, and it's divided into 2 lobes, a posterior lobe in the rear, which is neural tissue that secretes hormones, but they're called neurohormones. It's really part of the nervous system. The posterior lobe, the infundibulum, make up the neurohypophysis. The front part, the anterior pituitary, is the adenohypophysis because it's part of the endocrine system, and that is glandular tissue like we've been discussing in the last few sections. So there is a relationship between the pituitary and the hypothalamic. Posterior lobe is neural tissue of the, we just said, of the pituitary. It's a downgrowth from the brain. It maintains a neural connection to the hypothalamus, so it's kind of the go-between between the nervous system and the endocrine system. There are tracts that arise from neurons in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei in the hypothalamus, and they run through that infundibulum. They secrete 2 hormones that are important to us that we'll touch on in this section, oxytocin and ADH. Those hormones are stored in the axon terminals of the posterior pituitary and released into the blood when the neuron fires. So much the same way that we released neurotransmitters, but these act as hormones, not as neurotransmitters. They don't just act locally. So the hypothalamus controls the release of hormones from the pituitary gland in 2 different ways. The hypothalamic neurons will synthesize oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone. The oxytocin and ADH are transported down the axons of the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary, and oxytocin and ADH are stored in the axon terminals of the posterior pituitary, and they would release when they are required. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary is just glandular tissue. It's derived from a whole different set of embryonic tissues. It's an outpocketing of the oral mucosa. Vascularly, it is connected to the hypothalamus through the hypophyseal portal system, which would include primary capillary plexus, hypophyseal portal vein, and secondary capillary plexus. Remember that a portal system goes from a capillary to a vein to another capillary. The hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary that regulates hormone secretion. Let's see. Posterior pituitary has axon terminals of neurons, so hypothalamic neurons. The paraventricular neurons produce oxytocin. The supraoptic neurons produce antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin and ADH are each composed of 9 amino acids, so they are very short peptides. They are almost identical, but they are different in 2 amino acids, so they share 7 of 9 amino acids with each other. Oxytocin is a strong stimulant of uterine contractions. It's released during childbirth. It is also the hormonal trigger, or a hormonal trigger, for milk ejection. And oxytocin uses a positive feedback mechanism, one of the exceptions. We don't need to fine-tune childbirth. We don't want to fine-tune milk production or milk ejection. Once it starts, you want it to go. So these are positive feedback mechanisms. You lose the fine-tuning. It also acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain using the PIP calcium second messenger system. Antidiuretic hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, in the hypothalamus there are osmoreceptors that are measuring the concentration of ions in the solids, plasma, for example, or cerebral spinal fluid. If the concentration is too high, That means we don't have enough water. It's not diluted enough. So the posterior pituitary would secrete ADH, and ADH is an antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic gets rid of water, so antidiuretics conserve water. And ADH targets kidney tubules so that they reabsorb more water and inhibit or prevent urine formation. The release of ADH is also triggered by pain, low blood pressure, which could be another signal of need fluid reserves, and there are some drugs that trigger ADH release. It is inhibited by alcohol and other diuretics. High concentrations will cause vasoconstriction. So ADH does have another function. If it is given in very high concentration, high doses, it will cause blood vessels to constrict. So it also has the name vasopressin. So our posterior pituitary hormones are oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. They work on their target organs. The hyposecretion and hypersecretion for oxytocin have been not investigated or not understood. Low secretion of ADH can lead to diabetes insipidus, which is nothing to do with glucose. It has to do with water intake. Or high secretions can lead to syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, SIADH. Again, that has to do with water balance. In the anterior, we have growth hormone, which we will look at, and it has a lot of targets. So diabetes insipidus is an ADH deficiency generally caused by damage to the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary, and those patients need to be kept well hydrated because they don't have a sense of when they are dehydrated. Syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, you get fluid retention that can lead to headaches and disorientation, and those patients need to be kept on fluid-restricted diets, and sodium levels in the blood need to be monitored very closely. So the anterior pituitary produces 6 hormones. All 6 of those hormones are peptide hormones. All but growth hormone use the cyclic AMP second messenger system that we talked about earlier. All but 2 are tropic hormones, and tropic hormones or tropins are hormones that cause the release of other hormones. So the 6 are growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. And the TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH are tropic hormones. Growth hormone is also called somatotropin. It's produced by somatotropic cells, has a direct action on metabolism, and indirectly it promotes growth. Its direct actions include glucose-sparing actions that decrease the rate of glucose uptake and metabolism, so it would have anti-insulin effects like glucagon. Triggers the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. It increases blood levels of fatty acids to be used as fuels and encourages cellular protein synthesis. Indirectly, growth hormone triggers the liver, skeletal muscle, and bone to produce insulin-like growth factors. And those insulin-like growth factors work for cellular uptake of nutrients to synthesize DNA and proteins that are needed for division, formation of collagen, and deposition of bone matrix. Growth hormone stimulates most cells to enlarge and divide. The major targets of growth hormone, though, are bone and skeletal muscle, which will enlarge and divide in response to growth hormone. Its secretion is regulated by growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, which would stimulate the release. That would be produced in response to low blood growth hormone or glucose levels or high amino acid levels. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH, which is also called somatostatin, probably more commonly called somatostatin, will inhibit the release of growth hormone, and it's triggered by increasing growth hormone levels and increasing insulin-like growth factor levels. There is another hormone called the hunger hormone produced in the digestive system called ghrelin that stimulates growth hormone release. Hypersecretion of growth hormone is caused usually by an anterior pituitary tumor. If it happens in children who are still growing, it leads to giantism. People can reach heights of up to 8 feet. If it occurs in adults whose growth plates have already closed, it would result in acromegalia, which would growth would continue in the hands, the feet, and the face, and they have a very characteristic look to them. But because the growth plates in the long bones have closed, though they don't get any taller. Hyposecretion of growth hormone in children results in pituitary dwarfism. Children not receiving supplemental growth hormone may not reach heights of 4 feet. In adults, hyposecretion of growth hormone doesn't seem to cause problems. So we have here a pituitary dwarf, a giant, and the woman is an average size person. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone that is also called thyrotropin, and it's produced by thyrotropic cells. It stimulates normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid, released when tropin-releasing hormone triggers it from the hypothalamus, and it's inhibited by rising blood levels of thyroid hormone, and they would act on the pituitary and the hypothalamus. It is also inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So we have a loop here. The hypothalamus releases thyrotropic releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland releases its hormones that work on the target cells, and we'll learn more about the thyroid gland in the near future. And thyroid hormones inhibit the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to keep this negative feedback loop working correctly. So we vary it under a very narrow range. We get fine tuning of thyroid's hormone release. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is also called corticotropin. It's secreted by corticotropic cells. It is a precursor to corticotropin. It's called pro-opiomelanocortin, and ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. And later on, we'll talk more about what corticosteroids do. The regulation of ACTH, it's triggered by hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone in daily rhythm, which is highest in the morning. But there are also internal and external factors that will alter the release of corticotropin releasing hormone, including fevers, hypoglycemia, and stress. The gonadotropins are FSH and LH. FSH is a follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. They're both secreted by gonadotropic cells in the anterior pituitary gland. FSH stimulates the production of gametes, whether it's egg or sperm. It got its name from its role in the development of the egg, because part of the development of an egg involves a structure called a follicle. But it does the same thing in egg and sperm, male or female. Luteinizing hormone promotes the production of gonadal hormones in females. Luteinizing hormones help mature follicles of the egg, trigger ovulation, release of estrogen and progesterone, a couple of other hormones. In males, it stimulates the production of testosterone. LH and FSH are both absent from the blood before puberty. They're regulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone that kicks in during and after puberty, and they are suppressed by the gonadal hormones themselves. So we have a typical negative feedback loop. Prolactin is secreted by prolactin cells of the anterior pituitary. It stimulates milk production in females. We really don't have a good role for it in males. It might be left over from evolution, the way nipples are. Its regulations primarily controlled by prolactin inhibiting hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone is more commonly known as dopamine. Prolactin inhibiting hormone prevents the release of prolactin until it's needed, and with decreased levels leading to lactation. Increased estrogen levels will stimulate prolactin. That's why breasts swell and they are tender during the menstrual cycle, one of the reasons anyway. Blood levels rise toward the end of pregnancy for prolactin, and suckling stimulates prolactin release and promotes continued milk production. Clinically, homeostatic imbalances, hypersecretion of prolactin is more common than hyposecretion. Hyposecretion is not a problem unless a woman is trying to nurse. Hyperprolactemia is the most frequent abnormality of anterior pituitary hormones, and clinical signs of that would include inappropriate lactation, lack of menses, infertility in females, and impotence in males.